the other thing I look at is, and I'm not sure if I get this right, but it's not talked about very much, is the relationship between the liberal middle class and the working class, which strikes me as being in a lot of problems and accounting for a lot of the disillusion of democracy.
Yes, this is very interesting for me because at the very beginning of your book, where you did the very lovely stuff about being brought up in a middle-class lefty household, I mean, my experience was the opposite. I was brought up in a working-class conservative household, and politics weren't talked about much in my home at all. And I sort of gradually kind of pieced things together from myself, from my own observations of the world. And when at about 14, I learned that when my mother talked about not getting your father into politics, and oh, they got into politics and there was a terrible row, when I learned that it was because he was right-wing compared to everybody else, I was incredibly shocked. I mean, I'd sort of, from the world around me, formulated a fairly left-wing approach, and was actually shocked and amazed to find that my parents didn't talk about it in front of me, much the opposite to you, and in fact they'd formulated entirely different opinions. I mean, my parents sort of, my mother had been made redundant 3 times before she stopped voting for Thatcher. I mean, it's an entirely different way to come from. And when I read your book, it struck me that prior to your sort of great revelation, to use the words of Muhammad, you were incredibly sentimental about the liberal left, and perhaps overly sentimental, and couldn't see that these dichotomies and dilemmas were also there. And I think, too, that you remain very sentimental about the trade union movement, which, in your sort of general demolition of the vicissitudes of the left and the mistakes of the left, are really, you know, not touched at all, and in fact have done lots of things in the past to damage the most vulnerable people in this country and around the world. Yes.
Right. Look, the trade union movement in the book, all I say is simply that they've behaved very well the past few years, far better than the liberal middle class, in that, you know, they absolutely opposed the war for very good reasons, but were prepared to make commitments afterwards. Whereas the type of people you get on, I don't know, Newsnight or Start the Week, you know, if you ask them who they were supporting, what they wanted, they'd look at you, you know, it would just be an entirely alien question. So I'm not being sentimental about the trade union movement. Again, you know, that's just, it's a narrative, it's a story, and when you look at what starts happening in 2004, 2005, I would say, whether you supported the war or opposed it, you'd have to say the trade union movement, not just in Britain, but in Europe and America, behave more morally, with more intellectual integrity than the liberal middle class. Now, to me, that doesn't seem sentimental. To me, that seems it seems a statement of fact, frankly. I mean, if you were going to say that sentimentality, you'd have to be able to say that
no, what I mean is, when you talk about the breakdown of socialism, your book discusses the breakdown of socialism over the 20th century, and as someone sort of brought up in a Rust Belt town, seeing how trade unions behaved and how they represented my recalcitrant father, who didn't want to be represented in that way by people who went and clocked in and sat all day in the pub, which was called the clocking in. So well known was it that everybody was doing that. You have to say that trade unions haven't always behaved well, and that trade unions themselves and their own behaviour did fuel the rise of Thatcherism, which did help to get us all where we are with socialism.
Yeah, I'm not denying any of that, though. You're just inventing stuff that's not in my book, really.
No, I'm not inventing stuff that's not in your book, because the fact that it isn't in your book doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that it's not something you're taking into account. No, Nick, you brought up this point that there is a difference between the way in which the working class left has behaved and the way in which the liberal left has behaved.
In reaction to the war against Iraq, yes. I make no wider claim.
Hadn't I said that we were going to try to sort of move a little bit from
but
this
you're attacking me for
point
stuff I
of
haven't
revelation?
written.
I'm not attacking you
for
stuff you haven't written.
Fine.
I'm suggesting to you that there is stuff outside the narrative of your book that is relevant to what's happened to the left, to what's happened to socialism, to the reasons why people reacted in the way that they did, to the idea that we should support Bush in attacking Iraq because it was part of the war on terror when it wasn't, and how it's not necessarily wrong to suggest that US foreign policy is part of the difficulty the world faces at the moment and not part of the solution.
Well, let's try and take that from the top then. If you want to understand factualism, you have to understand the furious reaction to the growth of trade union power, the strikes of the 70s and so on. I didn't deny that for a minute, and there were my books where I talk about that. Equally, nowhere in my book do I denigrate or say it is wrong to oppose Bush. I mean, this is just it's a bit hard to keep up at the moment.
I'm sure you're managing.
But I come back to my point of what I'm trying to write about is if I had done a book on, you could do. I mean, it's interesting. It's not very much talked about at the moment. What happened to the left?
That's because people only want to talk about what's in their book and what proves them right. I mean, that's part and parcel of the problem with the debate in Britain now, is that all of the pundits, if you're pro-war, if you're against war, everybody's concerned with being right.
But I say quite clearly in my book, I mean, I supported the Iraq War. I could have just easily opposed it. I mean, I say quite clearly in my book that people who criticised me were right. It's not a book any more than it's a book about what happened in the 70s with Margaret Thatcher and factories in Scotland.
Although it is about how socialism lost its way in the 20th century.
It's about a specific point of why is it that... Look, if you're on the left in the 20th century, of whatever sort, democratic, totalitarian, whatever, there was... If you listen to people, there is assumed that they talked as if there was a hierarchy. At the top was some kind of worker state or Bevanite democratic socialism in Britain, which was a bit like the kingdom of God. It never came, or it came in bits. Next was what we've got, liberal capitalist democracy, the welfare state, with some redistribution of wealth. And at the very bottom of the heap were... fascistic, racist, sectarian murders. Well, often murders, but also regimes and movements.
And the IRA.
That was the hierarchy.
And the IRA.
Yeah. That was the hierarchy.
Oh, no, they were quite high up.
That was the hierarchy. Now, what's different in the 20th century is, with socialism gone, is why is it that those sectarian, religious extremist, fascistic movements, why is it that people from the liberal left find it so difficult to oppose them and fight them properly, when they're clearly going to be around for a very long time? Bush could be gone soon, Blair could be gone tomorrow. That's what I'm writing about. If you want me to do an entire history of the second half of the 20th century and go where the ideas of 1945 came, it would just be vast and unmanageable. That's what I'm doing that book on. That's what the book's about.
But there is a widespread difficulty with opposing totalitarianism. I mean, not only the left is against it in this country, the right is against it in this country too, but nobody has any ideas about how to do it. You can see that just invading the country and
Sure.
Trying to impose some kind of top-down idea of liberal democracy isn't going to work. And what you need to talk about is what alternatives are, and just sort of cleaving yourself to what's around, whether you agree with it or not, because somebody is willing to do something is just not a platform from which to criticise others, really.
What I'm trying to do is...
Incidentally, I had a lot of trouble about the war myself. I mean, I sort of,
I mean, it was a difficult thing.
Lots of people did.
Yeah. What I'm trying to do is in as much as you may say it's futile, is writing a book can do anything, is I'm trying to clear away a species of denial I see, which is rather like denial of global warming. It's very comforting denial. uh,